The silver sunstone necklace Darren had given her felt unusually heavy against Peach's collarbone as she sat on her bed staring at the cream-colored envelope. It wasn't just paper and ink, it was an earthquake. For months, Peach had found her place. She was no longer the invisible girl. She was Darren's partner. They had survived bullies, family interrogations, and a 10-hour flight to Mexico. She had finally stopped looking for exits and started looking at the boy who held her hand. But the letter from the International School of the Arts changed the map. It was a full-ride scholarship to an elite boarding school 3 states away. It was the dream she hadn't dared to dream, and it started in exactly 14 days. The silent dinner.
That evening, Darren came over for dinner, buzzing with a rare kind of energy. He had been practicing a new series of ASL signs for adventure and was talking about a hiking trip he wanted to take her on in July. Peach couldn't eat. Every time Darren laughed or Marcus made a joke, she felt like she was watching a movie of a life she was about to leave behind. She kept her hands in her lap, her fingers twisting together, a nervous habit she hadn't had since before Mexico. Darren noticed. His chill exterior shifted into high-alert mode. He watched the way she avoided his eyes, the way her shoulders were hunched toward her ears again. After dinner, as they sat on the porch steps, he finally nudged her shoulder. "Peach," he said softly. "You've been 1,000 miles away all night. Talk to me." Peach pulled her notebook from her bag, but her hand was shaking so badly she couldn't form the letters. She realized there was no easy way to write this. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded acceptance letter, handing it to him with a look that begged for forgiveness. Darren took the paper, his expression curious. He read the header. Then he read the word, scholarship. Then he read the date, July 1st. The silence that followed was different from any they had shared. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the beach or the comfortable silence of the library. It was the silence of a glass vase shattering on a tile floor. Darren's hands dropped to his sides. He looked at the letter, then at the girl who was now crying silently, her chest heaving without a sound. 3 states away? Darren's voice was a whisper, stripped of its usual confidence. "Peach, this is in 2 weeks." She grabbed her pen and scribbled frantically. "I didn't know. My art teacher sent the portfolio." "Darren, I'm not going. I'll stay here. I'll stay with you." Darren stood up pacing the small wooden porch. His heart was screaming for him to agree, to tell her to stay, to keep her in the safety of the world they had built, but he looked at the letter again. Elite Fine Arts Program. Full residency. This wasn't just a school, it was her voice. If he kept her here, he was stealing the very thing he had fought so hard to help her find. Darren stopped pacing and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his to stop her frantic signing. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "Peach, look at me," he commanded gently. When she did, he used the signs he had spent months perfecting. "You are going." Peach shook her head, tears blurring her vision. She reached for the notebook, but Darren gently pushed it away. "I told you in Mexico that you're the bravest person I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Staying here because you're afraid to be without me? That's not you. You're a world-class artist, Peach. You're going to go to that school, and you're going to show them exactly who you are." "What about us?" she signed, her movements small and broken. Darren reached out and touched the silver sunstone at her neck. A small, sad, but determined smirk played on his lips. "I'm the guy who faced down the varsity soccer team and survived a 10-hour flight with a girl who thought the plane was going to explode," he reminded her. "You think a few hundred miles is going to stop me? I'm Darren. I'm your shadow, remember? Even if the sun is 3 states away, the shadow doesn't just disappear." Peach leaned forward, burying her face in his shoulder. The news was out, the secret was gone, and while the fear of the distance remained, the weight of the envelope was finally shared. The countdown to July 1st had begun.
Chapter 2. The Impossible Anchor. The reality of Peach's departure acted like a slow-moving storm over the next few days. While her parents, Marcus and Elena, were busy scouting apartments near the academy, planning a massive life upheaval to support their daughter, Darren felt like he was standing on a shrinking island. He spent his afternoons at his own house, staring at the walls of the room he'd lived in since he was 5. He had a life here. He had a brother who taught him how to fix engines, a mom who made the world's best lasagna every Sunday, and a reputation as the chillest kid in town. Moving 3 states away wasn't just a trip, it was a total reset. But every time he saw Peach at school, her eyes filled with a quiet mounting dread. He knew she was bracing herself to be the silent girl all over again in a city full of strangers.
The kitchen table conversation. Darren didn't make the decision lightly. He spent an entire night sitting at his kitchen table, watching the clock tick toward 2 a.m. He realized that while Peach was brave enough to go, he wasn't brave enough to let her go alone. The next morning, he cornered Marcus and Elena in their garage as they were taping up moving boxes. "I want to go with you," Darren said. No preamble, no chill mask, just raw honesty. "Darren, you have a family here. You have school. You're 14 years old," Marcus said. "I know," Darren replied. "And my parents and I have already talked. My aunt lives 20 minutes away from the academy's campus. She's willing to let me stay with her during the week if my parents agree to let me transfer schools. But I'd rather stay with you guys. I want to be there for her, not just as a boyfriend, but as the person who knows how she thinks before she even writes it down." "It's a lot to ask of yourself, Darren," Marcus said quietly. "You'd be giving up everything you know." "I'm not giving up anything," Darren countered. "I'm choosing what matters. The goodbye to the life." He knew the hardest part wasn't telling Peach, it was telling his brother. Later that afternoon, Darren stood in the driveway as his older brother Jax worked on his car. "So you're really doing it?" Jax asked, wiping grease from his hands. "Leaving for a girl?" "It's not just for a girl, Jax. It's for the person who actually knows me. If I stay here, I'm just the chill kid everyone's afraid of. If I go there, I get to be who I actually am," Darren said. Jax looked at him for a long beat, then pulled him into a rough headlock, ruffling his hair. "You're a sap, kid, but you've got more guts than anyone I know. Just don't forget where we keep the tools." The surprise Peach was in her backyard, sitting under the oak tree and sketching a picture of the horizon. When she heard the back gate click, she didn't look up. A pair of familiar sneakers stepped into her line of vision. Darren sat down beside her. He reached into his bag and pulled out a stack of papers. Transfer enrollment forms. Peach looked at the papers, then at him, her mouth falling open. "Because," Darren said, leaning his back against the tree, "I checked the map, and 3 states away is too far for a shadow to travel every weekend. I talked to your parents. I talked to mine. If you're moving, I'm moving." "I told you, Peach," Darren whispered into her hair. "I'm not moving an inch from your side. We're going to find your voice together."
Chapter 3. The Broken Silence. The city of Philadelphia felt different after 2 years. The neon hum of the streets and the constant pulse of the art scene had become their new normal. At 16, Darren had grown into his height, his shoulders broader and his chill now seasoned with a protective edge that the city hadn't been able to dull. Peach, meanwhile, was the star of the academy. Her paintings were visceral, haunting, and louder than any voice could ever be. But for the last week, the air between them had turned cold. It wasn't the distance of miles anymore. It was the distance of a secret. They had been reckless. In the quiet of the city nights, feeling invincible and untethered from their old lives, they had crossed lines they weren't ready for. They had let the adrenaline of being young and in love override the caution they usually practiced.
The revelation at home Peach didn't wait. She couldn't. The moment the second pink line appeared on the plastic stick in her bathroom, her world fractured. Because she couldn't scream, she simply walked into the living room where Marcus and Elena were reading and dropped the test on the coffee table. The silence that followed was deafening. There were no shouts, only the sound of Elena's sharp intake of breath and Marcus putting his book down with a heavy, hollow thud. "Darren?" Marcus asked, his voice sounding older than Peach had ever heard it. Peach nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor, her fingers tracing the silver sunstone necklace that felt like a lead weight. "We'll handle this," Elena whispered, pulling Peach into a shaky embrace. "But Peach, you have to tell him. You can't carry this silence alone."
The Park of Shadows. Peach spent 3 days avoiding Darren's calls. She skipped their usual meeting spot at the coffee shop and spent her studio hours staring at a blank canvas. She was terrified. Darren had sacrificed his entire life to move here for her. He had left his family, his brother, and his home to be her shadow. How could she tell him that she had just potentially ended his future? How could she tell the boy who protected her from everything that she was now the source of their biggest crisis? Finally, she sent him a text. Rittenhouse Square. The fountain. Now. When she arrived, Darren was already there, leaning against the stone edge. He looked tired. He'd been worried sick, and the cool exterior was fraying at the edges. When he saw her, he stood up quickly, his eyes scanning her face for the source of the week's tension. "Peach," he said, his voice reaching for her. "What is it? Is it the school? Did something happen back home?" Peach stood 3 feet away from him. Her hands, usually so fluid and expressive, were locked at her sides. She felt like she was suffocating. She reached into her bag, not for her notebook, but for a small, crumpled sonogram photo her mother had helped her get that morning. The falling sky. She didn't sign it. She didn't write it. She simply stepped forward and pressed the black and white image into his hand. Darren looked down. At first, his brow furrowed, his brain trying to process the grainy shapes. Then, the blood drained from his face so quickly Peach thought he might collapse. The photo fluttered in his fingers, caught in the cool city breeze. "Peach!" His voice cracked. The protector was gone. In his place was a 16-year-old boy who suddenly realized the world was much bigger and much scarier than he had ever imagined. Peach's hands finally moved, but they were jagged and sharp, the signs coming out in a blur of panicked motion. "I am sorry. I am so sorry. You gave up everything for me and now I did this. I told my parents. They are mad. They are sad. You should go home. Go back to Jack's. Go back to your mom." Darren didn't move. He stared at the photo, then at her. The silence stretched out, filled only by the distant sound of city traffic and the splashing of the fountain. Peach waited for the anger. She waited for him to realize that his life, his football games, his graduation, his normal path, was disappearing. She waited for him to turn and walk away. Instead, Darren took a ragged breath and stepped toward her. He didn't look at the photo again. He looked at her. He reached out and grabbed her shaking hands, holding them firmly between his own, forcing her to stop signing. "I'm not going back to Jack's," he said, his voice low and trembling, but gaining strength with every word. "I'm not going back to my mom." He pulled her into his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head just like it had 2 years ago behind the gym. "I told you on that porch before we moved," he whispered into her hair. "I'm not moving an inch from your side. We're 16, Peach. We're kids, and I'm terrified." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his flint gray gaze returning with a new, somber resolve. "But we're doing this together. I'm still your shadow, and shadows don't leave when things get dark." Peach let out a sob, a rare, guttural sound that she couldn't contain. She buried her face in his shirt, the silver sunstone pressed between them, as the two of them stood in the middle of the city, bracing for a storm that neither of them knew how to survive.
Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. The months that followed were not a graceful journey into parenthood. They were a relentless assault on the lives they had barely begun to build. At 16, most kids were worrying about driver's licenses and prom themes. Darren and Peach were worrying about heartbeats and insulin. Because Peach was high risk, the appointments were frequent. At the 12-week mark, Darren sat in the dim light of the sonogram room, clutching Peach's hand so hard his knuckles were white. The technician was quiet, too quiet. She moved the transducer over Peach's stomach, her brow furrowing. Then she stopped, clicking the mouse to freeze the grainy image on the screen. "I'm going to call the doctor in," she whispered. Peach gripped Darren's arm, her eyes wide and searching. "What's wrong?" She signed, her movements small and frantic. Darren shook his head, his chill mask crumbling. The doctor arrived, adjusted his glasses, and began to point at the screen. 1, 2, 3. He paused, moving the wand slightly. 4, and there, tucked behind the others, 5. Quintuplets. The word hit the room like a physical blow. Peach's breath hitched, a high, thin whistling sound escaping her throat. The world began to tilt. 5 babies. Her body, already fragile, felt like it was being asked to carry the weight of the entire world. She began to hyperventilate. The monitors attached to her fingers started beeping frantically as her heart rate spiked. She tried to sign, but her hands were a blur of meaningless, spastic motion. It was a full-blown panic attack. She felt like she was drowning in the middle of a crowded room. Darren didn't hesitate. He climbed onto the narrow exam bed, pulling her into his lap and pinning her hands gently against his chest. "Look at me, Peach. Just me. 5 heartbeats, okay? We'll find 5 ways to handle it. Breathe with me." Darren's shadow. The new battle. As Peach's pregnancy progressed, the physical toll on Darren began to manifest in ways they didn't expect. He was exhausted, but it was more than just the stress of working 2 part-time jobs and finishing school. He was losing weight rapidly, his vision was blurring, and he was constantly, unquenchably thirsty. He collapsed in the school hallway 3 weeks later. The diagnosis was type 1 diabetes. The doctors said the extreme stress had likely triggered an underlying autoimmune response. Suddenly, the protector had his own set of needles, sensors, and life-altering rules. He had to learn to manage his own blood sugar while helping Peach navigate a pregnancy that was stretching her skin and her spirit to the breaking point. Sometimes they would sit on the floor together, Darren injecting his insulin while Peach rubbed her aching belly. 2 children playing at being gods, trying to keep 7 lives afloat. The 6-week scare. The babies arrived early, via emergency C-section, tiny and translucent, living in the plastic cocoons of the NICU. For 6 weeks, Peach lived in a haze of pumping milk and staring at monitors. Then, the floor fell out from under them again. It happened at 2 a.m. Peach had been home for a rare 5-hour sleep when she woke up drenched in a cold sweat. She tried to sit up, but her vision turned into a kaleidoscope of black spots. She tried to reach for Darren, but her hand felt like it weighed 100 pounds. She suffered a massive postpartum hemorrhage combined with an infection that turned septic within hours. Darren woke to the sound of her falling against the nightstand. He saw the blood and the ghostly pallor of her skin and felt a surge of adrenaline that sent his own blood sugar plummeting. Shaking, he managed to call 911 and swallow a glucose gel before the paramedics arrived. For 48 hours, Peach hovered in the gray space between life and death. Darren sat in the ICU hallway, his insulin pump beeping a low battery warning he was too numb to notice. Marcus and Elena stood by him. But Darren was in his own world, a world where the silence was no longer a beautiful thing they shared, but a terrifying void that threatened to swallow her whole. On the 3rd morning, Peach opened her eyes. She was weak, her hands too shaky to sign properly. She looked at Darren, who looked like a ghost of the boy she had met behind the gym. Slowly, she raised her hand and touched her chin, then moved it toward him. "Thank you." Darren leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closing in a prayer of pure exhaustion. "Don't thank me," he whispered, his voice cracked and raw. "Just stay. I can't be a shadow if there's no light to follow." They were 16, broken and chronically ill, with 5 tiny lives waiting for them in the building next door. The chill was gone forever, replaced by a jagged, unbreakable will to survive. Chapter 6. A House Full of Sunstones. The apartment in Philadelphia was no longer a quiet sanctuary for 2 teenagers. It was a colorful, chaotic fortress. On the morning of the girl's first birthday, the air smelled like vanilla cake and iron-on glitter. 5 high chairs were lined up in the living room like a tiny, demanding jury. Maya, Alara, Juno, Cleo, and Little Wren. All 5 had inherited Darren's flint-gray eyes and Peach's radiant, silent smile. The digital shadow between the mountain of diapers and his own insulin management Darren had found a way to bridge the gap between his protective nature and the outside world. He started a video series titled The Silent Protector. Initially, it was just short clips of him teaching ASL basics to fathers of nonverbal kids, but it quickly evolved. He became a voice for young caregivers and those living with type 1 diabetes. His chill demeanor, now tempered by the grit of fatherhood, resonated with millions. "You don't need a loud voice to be heard," he'd sign to the camera while a toddler climbed his back. "You just need to show up." He wasn't just Peach's shadow anymore. He was a beacon for people who felt invisible. The sponsorships from the videos finally gave them the financial breathing room to move into a house with a yard. The art of resilience Peach had found her stride again, though her studio was now a corner of the nursery protected by a baby gate. Her art had shifted from the dark, haunting imagery of her pregnancy to massive, vibrant canvases. She used a technique involving heavy textures, something the girls could touch and feel. Her latest series, 5 Hearts, 1 Pulse, had been picked up by a major gallery. She was no longer just the talented mute girl. She was a force in the contemporary art world. When she painted, she didn't just capture light. She captured the sound of 5 little heartbeats. The summer of reunion. The front door flew open in mid-July, and the quiet city street was suddenly filled with the roar of a familiar engine. Jack stepped out of an old truck, followed by Darren's parents, who looked like they were ready to burst with anticipation. "Look at this place," Jax whistled, stepping into the living room and immediately being swarmed by 5 crawling toddlers. "You went from chillest kid in school to commander-in-chief of a small army, huh?" Darren grinned, hugging his brother. He looked at his mom, who was already crying as she picked up Ren. For the first time in 2 years, the house felt complete. The sacrifice Darren had made, leaving his family behind, was finally coming full circle as his old world and his new world merged. The first birthday. That evening, the backyard was strung with fairy lights. Marcus and Elena grilled while Jax attempted to teach the girls how to fist bump, much to Peach's amusement. When it came time for the cake, the yard went quiet. 5 tiny cupcakes, each with a single candle, were placed in front of the girls. Peach looked at Darren. He was checking his continuous glucose monitor on his phone with one hand while holding a camera in the other. He looked older, tired, and incredibly proud. Peach tapped his shoulder to get his attention. She didn't use her notebook. She didn't use the tablet. She signed with a slow, graceful confidence that brought tears to her mother's eyes. "Look at what we built from a Tuesday behind the gym." Darren set the camera down. He reached out and touched the silver sunstone necklace Peach still wore every day. "We're just getting started, Peach," he said aloud, his voice steady. As the girls dove into their cakes, covering their faces in pink frosting and let out silent, joyful laughs, the 2 16-year-olds stood together. They were no longer the broken kids or the reckless teens. They were the architects of a beautiful, noisy, silent life. The sun set over the Philadelphia skyline, casting long shadows across the grass. Shadows that were no longer lonely, but part of a much larger, brighter picture. Chapter 7. The Gold and the Ghost. The fuck ton of money, as Jax called it, didn't come in a trickle. It came in a flood. Darren's Silent Protector brand had exploded. What started as raw, honest videos about fatherhood and diabetes had turned into a media empire. Tech companies wanted his face for accessibility apps. Medical giants wanted him as the spokesperson for new insulin pumps. By the time the girls were 18 months old, the kid from the gym was a millionaire. They moved again, this time to a sprawling, sun-drenched estate on the outskirts of the city, a place with enough rooms for 5 growing girls and a professional-grade art studio for Peach. But as the zeros in the bank account grew, so did a cold, familiar knot in Peach's stomach.
The silent, distant Peach watched Darren from the studio window. He was on the sprawling lawn, wearing a crisp designer shirt instead of his old hoodies, talking into a headset while juggling two of the toddlers. He looked like a man of the world. He looked like someone who could have anyone. The fear was a ghost that hadn't left her since she was 14. Back then, she wondered why he'd want a girl who couldn't talk. Now, the stakes were higher. She looked at her reflection. Tired eyes, paint-stained hands, and the permanent mental fog of raising quintuplets. Why would he stay? She thought. He's rich. He's famous. He has the resources to walk away and just send a check. He doesn't need to deal with the silence, the sign language, or the chaos of 5 kids anymore. Every time he stayed late at a meeting or flew to New York for a signing, Peach felt the walls of the mansion closing in. She became hyper-fixated on being perfect. She kept the house spotless. She worked until her fingers bled on her canvases, and she stopped signing about her worries. She didn't want to be a burden to the man who was now a mogul.
The Ledger of Secrets. One rainy Tuesday, Darren left his laptop open on the kitchen island to go change a blowout diaper for Cleo. Peach, usually respectful of his privacy, found her eyes drawn to a spreadsheet labeled Outflow, Quarter 3. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This is it, she thought. The exit fund. The lawyers. The apartment for himself. She leaned in, her eyes scanning the rows. But the numbers didn't make sense for a man planning a getaway. $25,000. The American Diabetes Association. Youth Camp Fund. $40,000. The ASL Literacy Project, $15,000. New van for Jack's, surprise $30,000. Anonymously clearing medical debt for NICU families. The total at the bottom was well over $110,000. Not a cent was spent on a secret life. It was all being poured back into the world, helping people who were struggling just like they had been.
The confrontation. Darren walked back into the kitchen smelling like baby powder and expensive coffee. He saw Peach standing over the laptop, her face pale. "Peach?" he asked, his brow furrowing. He saw what she was looking at. "Oh, I wanted those to stay anonymous. I didn't want you to think I was just throwing money around." Peach didn't use her notebook. She didn't even use her hands at first. She just began to shake, a small choked sound escaping her throat. She finally raised her hands, her signs jagged and panicked. "I thought you were leaving. You have everything now. You are rich. You don't need the girl who can't talk. You don't need 5 crying babies. You could have a quiet life." Darren stood frozen. The rich mogul vanished instantly. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, grabbing her hands and holding them against his heart, the same way he had when she was 14, when she was pregnant, and when she was dying in the ICU. "Peach, look at me!" he said, his voice dropping into that dangerously low protective register. "I spent 10 years being chill because I had nothing worth fighting for. Everything on that screen, that's just paper. It's just a tool." He took a deep breath, his eyes shining with a mix of hurt and fierce loyalty. "I didn't move 3 states away and learn a new language and poke myself with needles every day because I wanted to be rich. I did it because of you. If I lost the money tomorrow, I'd be back at that taco stand in Mexico with you and the girls, and I'd be the happiest man on earth." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, opening a private savings account she hadn't seen. The name on the account wasn't his. It was a trust fund for the girls, titled The Peach Orchard. "Every cent I make is a brick in a wall I'm building around this family," he whispered. "I'm not walking away, Peach, I'm fortifying the house." Peach let out a long, shuddering breath, the ghost finally leaving her. She leaned her forehead against his, her hands moving softly now. "I'm sorry. I'm still the shy girl sometimes." Darren kissed her forehead, then her paint-stained knuckles. "And I'm still the shadow, and the thing about shadows, Peach, they only exist as long as the light is there. You're the light. I'm not going anywhere."
Chapter 8. The Shadow and His Sunstones. The world saw Darren as a 17-year-old titan of industry, but to the 5 tiny girls currently wreaking havoc on a private jet, he was just Dad, the guy who always had fruit snacks in his pocket and a steady hand to hold. A year ago, on the night of the girl's 2nd birthday, Darren had taken Peach back to the quiet park where they had first shared the news of the pregnancy. There, amidst the city lights, he had dropped to one knee, He hadn't used a fancy speech. He had signed, "I've been yours since the gym. Let's make it official." They married on a crisp autumn morning when they were 17. It was a small ceremony in their backyard, filled with the scent of wood smoke and expensive lilies. Peach had worn a dress the color of a summer sunset, and the girls, 5 matching flower girls in white lace, had nearly tripped over the train. When the officiant asked for the vows, Peach had used her hands to sign a poem that moved every guest to tears, while Darren's voice remained steady as he promised to be her interpreter, her protector, and her home for the rest of their lives.
The traveling circus. As the girls approached their second birthday, Darren's schedule became more demanding. He was no longer just a digital creator, he was a keynote speaker at global accessibility summits and medical tech conferences. "I'm not leaving them behind," Darren had told Marcus and Elena, "and I'm definitely not leaving Peach." So the Silent Protector tours became a family affair. Darren traveled with a small entourage, a trusted nanny, a pediatric nurse for the girls' safety, and his wife. In London, for a summit on inclusive education, Darren took the stage with little Wren balanced on his hip. He spoke to a room of 3,000 people about the importance of seeing the unseen child. As he spoke, Wren mimicked his signs, her tiny hands touching her chin for "thank you" to the roaring applause of the crowd. Behind the curtain, Peach watched on a monitor, sketching the scene. She saw the way Darren checked his insulin pump with the same casual grace he used to adjust Maya's headband. He was a man who handled a fuck-ton of money and global fame, yet his eyes never stopped searching the wings of the stage until they found hers. The special events. One of the most significant trips was to a gala in Los Angeles. Darren was being honored for his $500,000 donation to a new wing of a children's hospital. The media was buzzing, the red carpet was blinding, and the pressure was immense. For the first time, Peach didn't feel the ghost of fear. She stood on the red carpet in a stunning emerald gown, her silver sunstone necklace catching the camera flashes. Juno and Alara were holding Darren's hands while Cleo and Maya were being carried by their grandparents, who had joined the trip. A reporter thrust a microphone toward Darren. "Darren, you're 17, a father of 5, a philanthropist, and a mogul. How do you keep it all together without burning out?" Darren looked down at his daughters, then at Peach, who was standing beside him, signing a joke to Cleo that made the toddler giggle. He didn't look at the camera. He looked at the reporter with that old flint-gray chill that had now evolved into a deep, unshakable peace. "I don't keep it together," Darren said into the mic. "They do. I'm just the guy lucky enough to walk in their shadow."
The quiet moments. Back at the hotel after the gala, the chaos finally